Let's add some stuff to our scene so we can get familiar with game objects, components, and getting around in the scene view. We will start by adding an empty game object in the Hierarchy tab. Now that we have a game object, let's move it to the world origin 000. With the game object selected, over here in the Inspector tab, we could type 0 in each one of these position fields. Or we could come up to the Component Context menu and use the Reset function. This will reset all values in the component to their default blank states. In the case of the Transform component, it will move the game object to the world origin, set all rotation fields to 0, and all scale fields to 1. Now we can add a couple more components to this object. First, let's add the Mesh filter. That associates this object with a mesh. Now we can add a Mesh renderer component to cause the mesh to be visible in the scene. We've added these components, but nothing is different in the scene view. This is because we have to set up the components in the inspector. First, we'll set a mesh from the stock meshes available. We can do this by selecting the little target next to the empty mesh filter. This will open the Select Mesh window where we can see any meshes present in the Assets folder as well as 6 stock meshes. I'm going to choose the cube mesh. Next, we will add a material to the mesh renderer so that Unity knows what shader to use in the same manner that we added the mesh. I'll use the Target Select button on the far right hand side in the Materials array at element 0. Then I'll choose the default Diffuse material. Now we have a cube in our scene view. Let's rename our cube and make a couple of copies. We can right-click the game object in our hierarchy and select Rename. I'm going to name this little guy Cube. We can use the duplicate feature we saw just a second ago to create a copy of the object in the hierarchy here. We could also use the standard keyboard keys for copy-paste, which is Control-C and Control-V. You could also highlight it, go up to the Edit menu, copy, and paste there. You can delete an object by pressing the Delete key with the object selected, or right-clicking on the object and selecting Delete. Or again, you can use the Edit menu. Now that we have a couple of objects, let's move them around a bit. With the Translate tool selected, I'm going to move this first cube off to the side a bit. I can do that by selecting the cube I want to move in the hierarchy and clicking along one of these axes arrows to move the cube along that axis. I could also click within this box in the middle to move along a plane, which is a pair of axes. I'll select the third cube now and move him off to the other side. Next, I'm going to grab this middle cube here, and I'm going to rotate him a bit with the Rotate tool. Again, you can rotate along axes, or rotate along multiple axes at the same time, or if you use this outer ring, that will rotate by the view, so it's relative to the view. Finally, I'm going to grab this far guy on the right hand side here and select the Scale tool, and we'll play with that a little bit. Again, you've got some axes that you can go specifically along, or you can scale by all of the axes simultaneously, uniformly. And something to note is that when you scale into a negative value, it will flip the geometry along that axis. A little hard to see with a cube. If you pay attention to these two faces here, you'll see them flip. If you want to be keyboard specific with any one of these movements, you can do that in the inspector in the Transform component. At this point, I'm going to let you do some free play and play with these tools and these cubes we've created. You can create a bunch more, and we'll create some kind of little scene out of these cubes and see what you come up with. One last thing I want to point out is that by dragging an object on top of another object in the hierarchy, you can group objects together. In this case, I've grouped all of the cubes that I've created here into a cube scene object. This makes organizing in the hierarchy a lot easier. You can use empty game objects just like folders, and then you can drag your other game objects into them. So if I made this game object, I can press F2 as the shortcut to rename an object, and type cameras. I can put the main camera and any other cameras in there. I can also create a new game object and make this one called lights and drag my light into there. Now, when you have this parent-child relationship, something to pay attention to is that the parent's world coordinates will be in the transform for the parent object. The position coordinates are based upon world coordinates, but the child coordinates are based upon coordinates relative to the parent. So as you move the parent object around in the world, you'll notice that the child object stays in the same position, 0, 0, 0. Just as we did with our assets folder in the project view, I'm going to create a couple of empty game objects and create a structure, a hierarchy within the hierarchy tab to help us keep our scene organized. I'll use some of the more common nomenclature here as I create a couple of these. We may not actually use them all for this project, but I want you to be familiar with the kinds of groupings you'll see as you're developing in Unity. I've placed the existing game objects we had in our scene into these folders. The camera, dynamic objects, gameplay, GUI, management, lights, and world game objects are all serving as folders. Something to be aware of that'll make your life a whole lot easier is always create your empty game objects, your containers, at world coordinates 0, 0, 0. That'll make your life a whole lot easier going forward.